Get your torque sockets ready because today we're going to be taking an in-depth look inside the BMW N52 engine. Now we're going to be tearing down this N52 engine to see what's inside and how it works, but we're also going to take a look at some of the weaker points on this engine to look out for, although this is probably one of BMW's more reliable engines. Now the BMW N52 is a naturally aspirated inline 6-cylinder engine. This is the 3-liter version that's out of an E90 328xi. Now the N52 is also the last naturally aspirated inline 6 engines from BMW. Everything's just been replaced by turbocharged 4-cylinders now. Now we're going to start by taking a quick look around this engine here. Now these are longitudinally mounted engines, which means that this part here faces the front of the vehicle and has all of the accessories driven off of this crankshaft. Over here we have the oil filter housing, which is nice and easy to access. At the top here we do have a plastic valve cover. Now keep in mind that this engine is actually tilted slightly sideways so that this oil cap would be nice and flat. We've got the intake over on this side. Now at the top of this leaky plastic valve cover here, we've got the Valvetronic motor, which is responsible for adjusting the valve lift. And of course we've got our wiring harness. They're going to connect to the 6 coil packs that sit on top of it. Now over on this side here you can see just how slanted the engine mount is because the engine is tilted, as well as the axle shaft for the passenger side. Now over in this area here is where the water pump is housed. It's actually an electrically controlled unit. It's not powered off of the crank pulley like many other vehicles. Then on this side here we do have your exhaust ports. Now I'm going to begin the teardown by removing this valve cover. But first we got to get this wiring harness out of the way. You'll notice this is the wiring harness that connects to the fuel injectors, which would normally sit inside of the head here. That's because this engine is port injected only. Now down here at the block we have 2 knock sensors, one on this side of the block and one over here on this side of the block. Next up I'm going to remove these 2 bolts here that hold the Valvetronic motor to the valve cover here. And there's the Valvetronic motor. Next I'm going to remove all the valve cover bolts. Now part of what makes this engine a real BMW is that it leaks oil. Either it leaks it from the Valvetronic motor over here all over the valve cover, or it leaks it from the valve cover interface with the cylinder head. As you can see here, it's all wet. Now having this motor slightly tilted in the engine bay doesn't really help, and this is the area that's always going to get wet. Now there's a lot of things to disconnect if you do have to do a valve cover job in your car. Alright, next I'm going to remove all the bolts. And remove that valve cover. Now with the valve cover removed, we can see the guts of BMW's Valvetronic technology. Basically, it uses the camshaft over here and then some counter rockers over here, which is controlled by that motor, which turns the shaft over here to adjust the valve lift inside of here. We're going to have a closer look at this when we tear this down. Now on the exhaust side, it's just a simple camshaft that drives a rocker arm system that pushes the valves down, and it's all kind of contained within this assembly here. Now supposedly this engine's here because of a timing issue. And I could tell because I can't even rotate the engine clockwise or counterclockwise. It's all locked up. Gonna see if I can use that to my advantage to break this bolt free. That was a lot easier than any Japanese car. And pull off the crank. Now the interesting thing with this engine is that there's no timing cover that goes in front of the block or the head, and that's because you have to remove this timing set with the camshaft and crankshaft gears and these plates here as an assembly up the top here. There's no cover that you remove in order to service it. Now that's a good thing because there's one less place for these BMW engines to leak. Now it's pretty obvious that this engine has double overhead cams driven off of a timing chain. Now on the intake and exhaust side we do have variable valve timing, which is called BMW's VANOS technology. It basically is going to phase the camshaft relative to the crankshaft from the timing chain. Now at the bottom here we have your VANOS actuators, which are your oil control valves for the intake and exhaust side, that are going to fill up those cam phasers and control the timing. Now I've already got another video on how variable valve timing works, so you want to check that out, linked above. These are 16mm bolts. For the exhaust side I'm going to remove all of these E10 bolts here. Just lift that off. Alright, I got a wrench holding that side there. That didn't work. Next I need to remove these VANOS solenoids here. And there's an 8mm hex here. And I'm going to remove this tensioner here. It's got a giant spring on the back. You know, you have to keep changing sockets. These are E10s and those were 10s. Here's your oil control valve. I'm going to pop off this cover here. And that's hiding another chain. Now before I can slide the timing set out, there's actually some hidden fasteners inside of here. You have another Torx in here. So here you can see where that bolt would plug into and line up with the crankshaft on this crank gear here. This is the timing chain. Now this is all going to come out as one assembly from the top here, just by lifting it up. Take out this bolt and the VANOS gear. Now this little ring here bolts onto the cover here, but it also gets picked up by the cam position sensor here and on the exhaust side. Now I can't get this bolt off, so normally this entire thing would slide up as one assembly with the exhaust cam gear. So I'll just slip the chain around, see if I can lift this up. So weird, you have a hex bolt to access a Torx bolt. Oh, jeez. Yo, it's stripping out. Alright, I was able to find a Torx that works. There's that stupid bolt. Alright, so I released the chain and the sprocket, and I can remove the exhaust camshaft from the engine. And now with the cams out of the way, I should be able to lift this assembly up and out. Now normally this would be removed as an entire assembly with the cam gears in here, but I was having so much trouble removing the cams. You can see that these guides are all plastic, and this here is where the tensioner would put tension on the chain. Now before I can turn this engine over, quite literally, I have to remove these little roller arms here, and here you can see the little hydraulic lash actuators. And you'll notice that this engine mount is actually on an angle. That's because the engine itself is mounted on an angle. Now taking a look at this oil pan, it's all made of an aluminum alloy, and it's held on by a bunch of E10 bolts going all the way around. At the bottom here we have the oil level sensor, and then the oil drain port at the bottom here. I'll just go around and remove all these E12 bolts. And I'll remove that oil pan. As you can see, all of these pockets here are completely full of engine oil. So to clean that up, I'm just going to use my wife's old hoodie here and sap all that up so it doesn't make a mess. Now inside the oil pan here, you can see you've got the pickup tube. It's going to bring oil into this oil pump, which is driven off of the timing chain over here at the front of the engine. And we've also got this oil pan baffle that I'm going to remove next. There's some slight carnage here from the timing chain guide that broke off. I'm going to remove this Torx bolt here. Take out the oil pump bolt. Now this engine has a lower oil pan that goes over all this, and then it has this upper oil pan, which is this thin section over here that helps to secure the block. So I'm going to go around and remove all of these E12 bolts so we can remove this at some point. It's not an E12. I'm going to pull off this oil pickup tube here from the oil pump and take off this oil baffle. So with this guide loose here, I can unbolt this and remove it from the oil pump. Then I can remove the oil pump assembly. So here now with the bottom of the engine and all the bolts around this bottom tray here loosened up, I'm going to then go ahead and remove the main bolts. These are responsible for holding the main bearings for the crankshaft that runs down the middle of the engine. These are 17mm. I'll just zip these off with the impact. Alright, and with all those bolts out, and I can lift off this bottom brace that holds the crankshaft on. Now with the bottom half of the engine block removed here, you can see we've got the crankshaft bearings here. Everything looks pretty clean, there's no major damage or anything. The next thing I'm going to do while I'm down here is I'm going to remove the connecting rod caps so I can loosen that off, and then I'll spin the motor back over and work on the head. These rod caps are E10 bolts. Now I'm just going to zip those bolts off with the impact. Remove this rod cap.
Now you're going to have your wife to help.
Alright, now I'm going to beg my wife to help me spin this engine over.
It's leaking.
Yeah, let it leak. Alright, so now I might be able to remove this crankshaft. Just like that. Now the head bolts are actually a T60, so I'm going to go ahead and crack those free here. Alright, now I'm just going to zip off these head bolts and remove them. Alright, and this here is your 6 inline pistons. Just pop these pistons out. Look at the second piston. This is a really nasty one. A lot of carbon buildup on the top, but the rod bearings look fine though. And now we've got the entire engine laid out here in pieces. We're going to start taking a closer look at these individual components and how they work. Now I'm going to start at the top of the engine here where we have this composite plastic valve cover here. Now some of the main features here include the catch system here for the positive crankcase ventilation. And if you spin it over, you can see that there's these ports here where it's actually going to bring up the ventilation from the crankcase itself and then kind of pass it through a labyrinth-like design. The idea is that it's going to trap oil before exiting back out into the intake. Now, a leaking valve cover is almost guaranteed on every BMW, from the valve cover gasket over here to even the Valvetronic seal, as well as the eccentric shaft sensor seal over here. Now changing a valve cover gasket on some BMWs is not so bad, but on smaller ones like a 3 Series or a 1 Series, it can be quite an involved job because there's a lot of stuff that sits on top of this. Next up, we'll take a look at the engine head. Now this here is the exhaust camshaft assembly. Now you'll notice with these camshafts is that they're actually enclosed inside of this frame over here, and they have the camshaft bearings inside of there and the oil passages to lubricate them. Now the camshafts themselves are actually hollow, and that's because they're hydroformed, which uses water pressure inside of this tube here to form the rough shape of this, and that's how you make a lighter weight camshaft. Now at the end here we have the variable valve timing gear for BMW's VANOS system. You can see we've got a top plate over here with the bolt supporting it and a spring, and then inside of here is the actual hydraulic actuator, which takes oil from these tracks over here, and those tracks are going to correlate to these tracks over here, which are going to get oil from the oil control valve. Inside of that variable valve timing actuator, the internal piece is what's going to shift relative to the external piece, and that's going to give you the difference in phase of the timing. You're just going to fill these areas up with oil. Now BMW's VANOS system is notorious for failing, although it's not really a catastrophic failure. It's most likely the engine losing some oil pressure, causing the timing to be off. Now if the timing is off really bad, it could end up with your valves clashing your pistons, but most likely you're going to end up with a VANOS code. Now varying the valve timing is highly dependent on oil pressure, which means that you have to have a good oil supply coming from the oil pump and thus the filter, as well as these two oil control valves here, which plug into the engine oil head. You can see this one here is going to feed this VANOS gear over here through the camshaft. This is just a simple oil control valve. Now a lot of times these can fail and go bad, or they can get stuck with crap inside of there. Now these actuators aren't too hard to replace because they're right at the front of the engine here. Just make sure that you replace the O-rings so that they also don't leak out of the timing side. Now another weak spot on some of these earlier N series engines are the hydraulic valve adjusters here. Now these here use a kind of roller rocker arm system to move up and down, which is going to push the valve up and down as the camshaft rides up on this part. But on this back part here you have this hydraulic valve adjuster, and this is basically a small little piston inside of here that fills up with oil to take up any slack in the system when the camshaft is riding up and down. Now sometimes on cold starts, when something's clogged in the system or there's insufficient oil pressure, it won't be able to fill this up fast enough, and then you're going to be hearing a lot of tapping noise from the top of the engine. Now that's not really harmful to the engine, though it's really annoying, and the solution to this is actually to replace the whole entire engine head as well as these valve lifters. Next up we come to BMW's Valvetronic technology, which is this big gizmo gadget on the intake camshaft on top of this head here. Now what this does is it essentially allows you to not have a throttle body and just adjust the valves themselves to open and close based on your throttle position from the driver's input. So for example, instead of when you step on the gas it opens the throttle body to let air inside, it's actually going to open up the amount that these valves lift. Although the camshaft is still turning, at idle it's not really going to open up much, but when you mash it down all the way, it's going to let a lot of air in and open those valves up. The advantage to this is that you're going to have less pumping losses because you don't have to create a vacuum in the intake anymore. Therefore, you're going to have near atmospheric pressure going right into the intake for a much more efficient and powerful combustion. Now the intake does have a backup throttle body in case the system fails with a traditional drive-by-wire throttle body, but the real motor that's driving all of this is this electric motor over here. So just like a throttle body motor, this is actually going to turn this shaft at the top here to adjust the amount of lift that the valves are getting down below. So you can see here this motor's got a worm gear on it, and then over here on this shaft we have a semicircular gear here, which is what it's going to interface, and as you turn that worm gear it's going to push that over there, and as I push that it's going to rotate this shaft down here. Now to demonstrate how BMW's Valvetronic works, we're going to take a look at how this mechanism works here. We've got our eccentric shaft over here, which is powered by that spiral gear we saw earlier, and it's got this cam profile on the outside here. Now that's going to touch this roller rocker arm style of system here, which has a double pivot, and that's going to contact the actual camshaft. Now the angle of that is then going to affect the contact with the actual roller, which is the one pressing down on the valve on this side, and there's a hydraulic adjuster on this side. Now you can see at the current position that this camshaft is at its maximum profile here, but the valve itself is actually at its minimum profile, and that's because the angle of this incidence here and here is what's bringing that valve to an almost closed position. Now in reality that would reflect a almost closed throttle because you don't want too much air to go into the engine when you're at idle. Now as I rotate this eccentric shaft here, it's going to change the angle of these two arms and thus push the valve down even though the camshaft position hasn't changed. And you can see at that position it presses the valve down to its maximum open position. Now in this setup you can get about 0.18 millimeters of minimum open valve, 9.9 millimeters of maximum open valve. Now although it kind of seems slow when I move that throttle body, this actually happens a lot faster because it's powered by this more heavier motor, and that actually powers all 12 valves on the intake side. Now although these two valves are to the same cylinder, they're actually timed slightly differently, so one opens a little bit earlier than the other, but once you're at max throttle they both open the same amount. And you can kind of tell that because this spring is a little bit wider open than this spring here, which has fully open. Now of course a complicated system like this could fail, and when it does fail, luckily it does have a backup throttle body so you can limp home. Now just like a throttle body, this motor here has to have some sort of feedback where that eccentric shaft is, and that's where you have the position sensor for it at the end of the shaft here. I don't like the fact that they've used plastic in these designs here, because plastics can cause a lot of rattling, especially when they wear out, or they can just crack and fail, as probably was the case in this engine. Now it's a nice thing that BMW's put the oil filter housing up at the top here, but one of the most notorious things to happen to this engine is of course it leaks. Now when this oil filter housing leaks, it's actually going to leak right on the serpentine belt, which is right at the front of the engine. Now of course oil and rubber don't mix, and having an oily serpentine belt is just going to chew it up and cause it to disintegrate. Now if someone replaces the serpentine belt and doesn't think to check, some of those chips of that serpentine belt actually get lodged inside of this front crankshaft seal here and enter the engine. Now once you've got rubber bits inside of the engine's oil system, it could cause big problems like starvation, as well as clogging up your oil pump for low oil pressure. Now taking a look under the engine head here, we do have a multi-layer steel head gasket design. Now supposedly this engine is here because of a timing issue, although I don't see any piston to valve clashing here, and all the valves look intact to me, although I do notice a lot of carbon buildup. Check out how dirty this is under here, especially on the intake side. Next up we come to the block itself. Now things are pretty straightforward, other than the fact that on the N52 engines it's actually a magnesium aluminum alloy and not just pure aluminum, and they've done that of course to make this block really lightweight, although the N54 turbocharged engines just use simple aluminum alone. Now they do have to put a coating on the inside of these water jackets and these bolt holes here to protect that magnesium from corrosion. Now another thing is most of the bolts I took out of this engine are also made of aluminum, and they're super lightweight, which is good for weight savings, but I guess, you know, you could strip them out pretty easy. Now powered off of the timing chain that goes to the oil pump is this vacuum pump integrated inside of the block here, and that's there to power things like the brake booster and any emissions components that require vacuum, and this is because the intake manifold has very little vacuum to power those things due to the Valvetronic system. Taking a look at the bottom of the block here, I noticed that all the bearings are in pretty good condition. Generally speaking, these engines do last pretty long mechanically, other than all the oil leaks. Now BMW's chosen to do a ladder frame like design for the bottom part here and sandwich the two together to form a two-piece crankcase design just for strength. Now one thing I didn't like was this little ridge here on the top of all these cylinder walls where the pistons stop. Now if we take a look at the piston itself, I mean it's not worn out, but it's really dirty and cruddy with a lot of carbon buildup inside of here. You can tell this engine wasn't really well maintained. Next up we come to the oil pump, which sits underneath the crankcase, and it's powered by the timing chain. Now this is actually a variable oil pump which can adjust to the amount of pressure required in the oil system. Now it does come with a plastic pickup tube here with a screen inside of here. Luckily this screen is nice and clean, so we know there was no serpentine chips inside of here. Alright, we'll crack this pump open here. And there's what the inside of this oil pump looks like. Now this is a mechanically driven oil pump. You can see the way this operates here. You got a little wedge here that pushes in, and you've got this spring that's always pushing in against it. Now maximum oil flow is going to be done when this is pressed all the way this way, and the center of this is basically eccentric to the outside, which means that you have oil that's going to come in here, and as the volume is expanding, more and more is going to be pushed, and then it's going to be squeezed out this way. Now when this is relatively relaxed and there's not that much oil pressure required in the system, there's no differences between these compartments, and you just get a regular stagnant oil flow. You can see the veins inside of there that turn when I turn this, which will be connected to the timing chain. Next up we have the crankshaft. Now this is just a typical forged crankshaft. However, the position of where these pistons are located are critical to balancing this engine. Now inline 6 engines are both balanced in primary and secondary forces, which make them one of the smoother engines out there. Finally we come to this oil pan, which is also made of an aluminum alloy. Now inside of here you can see we've got the oil level sensor, and that's because this engine doesn't have a typical dipstick. Now this level sensor is also an oil quality sensor. Now it uses capacitors to measure the dielectric properties of the oil to tell you the life as well as the level inside of the sump here. Now because this is an all-wheel drive car, you can see we have the tunnel here for the shaft that has to go through it to power the passenger side wheel with a differential located on this side. And that's pretty much all the components that go inside of BMW's N52 engine. Now this is arguably one of the more reliable engines from BMW, despite there being so many problems, but it's mostly due to oil leaks and there was no major mechanical faults with this motor. So if you're thinking about buying one of these, just make sure you don't have that Corolla budget and budget for a couple of extra repairs, mostly due to these oil leaks. Make sure you follow me on Instagram for more behind the scenes footage and subscribe for more videos just like this one.